A good day to all, Mabwika. Introduction. Almost all the stories of my people, the Garifuna of Belize, are authored by others whose perspectives are alien to our customs. Our traditional stories are rarely documented, not triangulated, and often forgotten. A people's story captures information from my 2024 booklet, The Premiere on the People Called Garifuna. It relates the history of Belizean Garifuna from the Amazon to the Caribbean, to Roatan and Trujillo, to the settlement, 1799, through to Belize at 1981. It highlights data often downplayed as the teachers who educated Belize from the 1880s also introduced new data about the presence of the Garinagu in the expansion of the settlement to the Sarstoon. The term Carib was applied to native Indians of the Caribbean islands by colonizers in the 1500s who perceived them as savages. This was intended to break people of their humanity. In 1635, Raymond Breton, a French Jesuit missionary, reported that the native Indians introduced themselves as Kalipuna, Kalinago, not Carib. A people story utilizes Kalipuna, Kalinago, and later Garifuna, Garinagu under four captions: who, genocide, advocacy, and contribution to nation building. Who are they? Amerindians, Arawaks, and Kalinago. According to the Bering Strait theory, some 30,000 years ago, groups of Amerindians, including the Kalinago and Arawaks, crossed the Bering Strait from Eastern Asia and traveled from Alaska to South America at 1500 BC. Later, they migrated from the tropical forests of the lower Orinoco in northern South America by canoe to the islands of the Eastern Caribbean by 1200 AD, long before the Europeans arrived. They were skilled agriculturalists and fisherfolk, adept at pottery and boat making. Over the years, they formed varying groups throughout these islands. The Arawaks and Kalinago settled in Dominica and St. Vincent. Due to the mountainous terrain, they lived on these islands undisturbed by Europeans for over 400 years. The Kalinago were dominant and overtook the Arawaks through conquest and mating. The offspring identified as Kalinago and assimilated each other's culture. They were nurtured at birth by the mothers, who were predominantly Arawakan, and acquired the mother's tongue. At puberty, the boys went with the fathers, who taught them their trades and language. Hence, there is a slight distinction between the language of the male and female. Enslaved West Africans. Colonialists planned a labor system of enslavement called the transatlantic slave trade. They forcibly enslaved West Africans, robbing them of their freedom, dignity, heritage, and life. They transported them to America via the Middle Passage, shackled as human cargo, and crammed into boats below deck. From 1525 to 1886, some 12.5 million West Africans were enslaved and moved to America. Some 60% came to Central America and the Caribbean. Islands of the Eastern Caribbean were colonized using enslaved persons to work the plantations. The exception was Dominica and St. Vincent due to the thickly forested and mountainous terrain of these countries. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807. Emancipation in this region was August 1, 1838. Black Kalinago, formation of a new people. By 1646, the presence of Africans in St. Vincent was documented. Two sources of African peoples to St. Vincent were runaway enslaved peoples from Barbados and captives from island raids by the Kalinago themselves. The island's thickly wooded mountainous environment was an escape route from enslavement. By 1700, the Africans and Kalinago had intermixed, and their offspring formed a new people in St. Vincent called the Black Kalinago. They assimilated each other's culture. From the Kalinago, the Amerindian foods, language, spirituality, and agricultural techniques. Ancestral celebration was West African, with some strong parallels in spiritual beliefs with the Bantu. The language is Arawakan-based, with some influences from the French and West Africans. The Kalinago, who had not yet mixed with African peoples, were called the Yellow Kalinago. Three peoples were now living in relative harmony in St. Vincent: Black Kalinago, Yellow Kalinago, and French settlers. The French came from French colonized islands of Martinique and St. Lucia and carved out small holdings for diversified farming. The Kalinago perceived them as trade partners and as allies against the British. Genocide, encroachment of the British on St. Vincent. The first attempt of British intrusion on St. Vincent in 1708 failed due to resistance from the Kalinago. Other unsuccessful efforts, including 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, the British tried to escalate explorations. 1748 agreement among Europeans to establish an Indian territory to declare St. Vincent and Dominica neutral was rescinded in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. 1764 to 1770, intense efforts to survey large tracts of lands were rejected by the Kalinago. By 1772, British escalated plans to eradicate the Kalinago as per a letter from Earl of Hillsborough to the governor of St. Vincent, April 8. And I open quote, "If necessary, demand the removal of the Caribs. You do take up such vessels and convey them to some unfrequented part of the coast of Africa or such adjacent island," close quote. The end game for the British was to rid St. Vincent of the Kalinago. This led to several skirmishes and the Carib War. Carib War, 1795 to 1797. Kalinago were led by Joseph Chatouillet, assisted by French allies led by French mulatto revolutionary Victor Hughes with men, food, and ammunition. The British were now in full force, having concerns after the successful Haitian Revolution in 1791. The Kalinago were ambushed in June 1796 at Dorsetshire Hill, Chatouillet having been killed in a duel earlier. They surrendered June 10, 1796. Many were killed, and their stores, homes, farms were burnt and plundered by the British. In October 1796, 4,200 Black Kalinago, 102 Yellow Kalinago, 44 Africans were forcibly moved to Balisau, a barren, rocky island off St. Vincent. On March 11, 1797, 50% remained as many died of diseases. They were dumped on the coast of Roatan, arriving on April 12, 1797, with 2,000 alive. They brought with them food, plants, rum, tools, cloth, and ammunition. By September 23, 1797, 4 months after arriving in Roatan, 75% of the Kalinago had moved to Trujillo. They populated 20 communities in Central America around the Bay of Honduras, from Stan Creek to Black River. Some adopted Hispanic names, and others maintained French surnames. Kalinago, Kalipuna gradually changed to Garinagu, Garifuna, due to regional linguistic differences. Over 2 million Africans were decimated at the hands of the British during the transatlantic slave trade. Over 60% Kalinago, Garinagu perished under siege by the British until Roatan. Advocacy, surviving in the settlement. Piracy became illegal, so the buccaneers as settlers moved in the Belize River settlement to extract logwood. The logwood was in Spanish territory, and 18th century Britain and Spain were constantly at war on the question of sovereignty. The Treaty of 1763 gave Britain limited rights to cut logwood, but the Spanish maintained sovereignty. War broke out in 1779, and the settlement was abandoned until peace was restored in 1783. The Treaty of Versailles of 1783 and the 1786 Convention of London permitted the settlers to continue logwood extraction limited to the Sabine River in the south. Agriculture and fortification were not permitted. By 1799, the Garinagu had arrived into the settlement looking for employment. They were held with suspicion by the British, who later enacted laws against hiring them. However, the settlers and the Spanish needed their skills. They were recruited by the Spanish to move goods, arms, escaped slaves along the coast in their long dugout canoes and as paid soldiers. They were useful to the settlers, who ignored all covenants and restrictions to expand the logwood extraction further south into Spanish territory. To them, the Garinagu were valuable as laborers and to maintain a presence, possibly as human buffer during the Spanish incursions. The advantage to the Garinagu was that they were free to live their culture away from the brutal rules of the British. The settlers illegally continued extracting logwood to Deep River by 1799 and early 1800s to Stand Creek, 1806 to Rio Grande north of Punta Gorda, and 1814 Moho River south of Punta Gorda. The Garinagu were therefore part of the expansion of the settlement to the present southern boundary. The settlement became the colony of British Honduras in 1862, Crown Colony in 1871, self-governing in 1963, and independent in 1981. The name British Honduras was changed to Belize in 1973. Championing Christianity. The Catholic missionaries were impactful in Trujillo, which continued to the colony. The missionaries expressed intolerance for African Amerindian cultures, so attacks on Garifuna heritage were relentless. By the 1880s, men were recruited and trained as teachers and catechists to expand Roman Catholicism in very remote areas of Belize. They, open quote, waded in belly-deep swamps to get to teaching force, traversed rough seas, forded flooded rivers, and entered virgin jungle to nurture the brains of Belizean children, close quote, A. Caetano. Garifuna communities were left leaderless for months at a time to educate and spread Roman Catholicism. Garifuna educators paid the ultimate price with their lives, a service that has not been fully recognized. Surviving on the Crown Colony. Garinagu held the monopoly on small-scale transportation from 1825 to 1870 to carry goods and arms along the coast for both Spanish and British. After the bust of logwood, the banana industry became lucrative. Men moved into the banana loading 1899 to 1901 in Tela with the United Fruit Company, 1911 in Trujillo, 1924 with the Standard Fruit Company. Garinagu worked on the docks, railroad, machine shops, and plantations, and also traveled to the US as loaders, cooks, and skilled seamen. A list of trades, 1897 to 1910, included rubber bleeder, shoemaker, tailor, mercantile clerk, sea captain, contractor, carpenter. Between 1904 and 1914, men were recruited to work in the construction of the Panama Canal. 1939 to 1945, they traveled to Scotland to contribute to the World War II effort. Benito Guerrero was appointed alcalde, but that governance system failed due to the individualistic nature of the Garinagu. Agitating for people's development and Garifuna spiritualism. The Garinagu were in the forefront of Garveyism, the 1914 UNIA movement. G.A. Nunes held the presidency for the local chapter. They advocated for change through the Unemployment Brigade led by Antonio Soberanes in 1932, Suffragette Movement 1949 to 1952, General Workers' Union Movement to 1954. This resulted in the 1951 constitutional change which removed stringent vote qualifiers such as land ownership, leading to the first free election of 1954. Nathaniel Carter was elected and became a member of the Legislative Council. They also formed social and economic community organizations such as the Carib International Sick and Burial Fund Society and Carib Development Society, both in 1924. The Dabuyaba is the spirit of Garifuna spirituality. For decades, families converged from near and far to the Dabuyaba in Dangriga to participate in the healing ceremony called Dugu. The caretaker for the Dabuyaba was Balvina Velasquez Cacho until her death in 1961 Hurricane Hattie at the age of 96. For decades, she was targeted by the Roman Catholic Church for refusing to close down the Dabuyaba. She eventually removed her children from the Roman Catholic schools. While the Dabuyaba was destroyed in Hurricane Hattie, it was immediately replaced in another location. Agitating for recognition and decolonization efforts. Garinagu demanded to be recognized for their contributions to Belize. Several leaders emerged, and the three who headed this effort were Catarino Bengoche, Thomas V. Ramos, and Mateo Avaloy. The petition was signed November 16, 1941 by all three. November 19, 1943 was declared a public and bank holiday in the South, then countrywide in 1975. Other advocacy efforts in 1975 were November 19th to be celebrated on the day itself, a name change from Stand Creek Town to Dangriga, a name change from Black Carib to Garifuna, Garinagu. Then on May 18, 2001, the Garifuna language, dance, and music were proclaimed masterpiece of oral intangible heritage of humanity by UNESCO. The November 19th endeavor has been attributed to T.V. Ramos as the sole leader. This narrative is not accurate. Contribution to nation building. Garinagu were hands-on in every facet of the development of these beliefs. They were instrumental to the expansion of the settlement to the present southern boundary while working as logwood cutters for the settlers. They were vanguards in the evolution of Belize's governance and broadening of democracy from colony to independence as members of the Legislative Council from 1954 to the Legislative Assembly 1961, National Assembly 1963 and 1981, until the parliamentary election of 2020. Garinagu educated Belize. From the 1880s, they traversed to extreme rural areas. Garifuna educators paid the ultimate price with their lives to educate Belize and spread Roman Catholicism. A. Cayetano. All Belizeans are beneficiaries of this major struggle. As such, we all celebrate November 19th, Garifuna Settlement Day. Lastly, the slave trade was intended to make commodities of humans. Enslavement began at the time of capture. Garinagu are an amalgam of two peoples, Amerindians and enslaved Africans in St. Vincent. As Amerindians, they claim indigeneity. The DNA of my sibling shows she's 85% African from 8 peoples and 15% Amerindian, which is synonymous to Afro-Caribbean peoples of Belize, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Itarala.